I remember the shock and surprise I felt when I first pried open my mother's big book of nursery rhymes, and when I just learned to read as a little kid. I found them to be so much more disturbing, dark, and grotesque than I had ever thought possible. I realized that my mother, my lovely mother, had been cleaning up, tidying up these nursery rhymes to make them a lot more palatable to my little kid mind. A lot of us have felt the same way when we finally opened the Bible. We found that a lot of stories that are told in Sunday school or even in pop culture are actually a lot more dark and even elements that are grotesque than we ever thought possible. My name is Daniel Gilman, and this week we're looking at Gracious God or Moral Monster, tackling some tough passages from the Old Testament. I remember being at Cambridge University and a student walked up to me and he said, "I despise the God of the Old Testament. He is the most intolerable bully in all of fiction." He was shaking with anger as he opened the Bible to Numbers 31 verses 17 and 18, and he read these words. "Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with them. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves." He said, why would the God of the Old Testament tell the people of Israel, his children, to commit genocide and rape? Genocide because they're killing all the young boys and men, and then rape because they're taking these women as their wives. That is forced marriage. I confessed to him that I hadn't ever considered the depths of this passage, so I thanked him for bringing it to my attention and asked if he'd join me in asking a colleague if they had any insights into this. Well, we did, and my colleague looked at us and tenderly but firmly said, "Gentlemen, you are approaching this passage with typical 21st century, Western-centric Anglo arrogance." Surprised and intrigued, we asked him to tell us more, and he did. He said, "If you actually humble yourself for a minute, you will see in this passage restraint from grotesque violence. You'll see justice for the oppressed and provision for the young women and girls." Restraint, justice, and provision. We invited him to tell us even more because we were utterly confused at how those three things could be in this passage. He said, "Guys, you need to consider the context that the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Jebusites, all the surrounding nations were constantly at war with each other. And when they warred against each other, it was in the most grotesque forms possible. They would be committing sexual abuse against other soldiers on the battlefield, putting people to death that way. They would be cutting people to have them bleed out slowly, and they would glory in the gore." And to that violent, grotesque context, God is calling the people of Israel to engage in warfare, putting people to death in the most humane methods available to them in their day. He wasn't introducing violence by calling them to warfare. He was actually holding them back as they were to put people to death swiftly with the sword. There is restraint there. And then why even engage in warfare? There's justice for the oppressed. God is very clear that the reason he's having the people of Israel march into Canaan and the conquest therein is because the surrounding nations, including the Moabites and the Midianites, were engaging in such violent and grotesque oppression of the marginalized and the young. This includes sex trafficking and offering their children to the gods by sacrificing them live in the fires and such like this. In Ezekiel 16, God defines very clearly the reason for his judgment and probably the most famous passage of judgment in all the Bible, which is regarding Sodom and Gomorrah. This is a direct quote. "They had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but they did not aid the poor and the needy." And I find these words so challenging to me personally because we can see that God holds to account not just those who perpetuate violence, but those who are indifferent to it. Not just those who are oppressing the poor, but those who remain indifferent. This is the heartbeat of God, concern for those who are lost, who are marginalized, and who are hurting. And so as these nations had been doing this stuff for so long, God finally, patiently, but finally brought his judgment. And in the case of Numbers 31 that we looked at, the Midianites had not only been engaging in these dark practices themselves, they'd enticed and led the people of Israel into doing that. And God was bringing judgment on them for this and justice for those who they were hurting. Well, the Cambridge student said, "Hey, that's actually beautiful, but what about the women?" And I chimed in too. What about these young women that it says they may take for their wives? Once again, this colleague of mine said, "Guys, consider their context. We want to project our 21st century laws and customs onto these women, thinking that we're some champions of women and girls. But by their own, the Midianites' own laws and customs, these young women would never have been able to own land. They wouldn't have been able to have a home. They wouldn't have been able to engage in commerce or have an income of any kind. And so if we just removed all the men from this context because of justice, now these girls will be left to die a death of slow starvation and isolation." And so if we're actually going to be concerned for them, then see the beauty in what God is telling the people of Israel. He actually defines in Deuteronomy 20, another passage, exactly the step-by-step process of being able to invite these women into these people's lives. And it is beautiful in the way that it gives these young women space to grieve. There's a whole process that is really beautiful. But the thing that we need to really zero in on is that the Bible forbids the people of Israel, God forbids the people of Israel from ever taking these women as sex slaves, even as concubines. If they're to be invited into Israel, it is only ever to be as wives. That includes legal status, human dignity, provision for their children, provision for these women. And so what we see in this passage is God a moral monster or a gracious God? We see that he's a God of restraint against grotesque violence, justice for the oppressed, and provision for young women and girls. He is a gracious God.